Eleanor Hayes had always known loneliness. She had never experienced the warmth of a loving home or the protection of parents. After her mother died when she was just a young girl, her world became a cold place. Her father, broken by grief, never seemed to recover from the loss. He became distant, consumed by his own sadness, and Eleanor often felt invisible. She was never the priority. When her father passed away unexpectedly, Eleanor was sent to live with distant relatives, who saw her more as a burden than a blessing. The house was large, but it always felt empty. Her relatives, though not unkind, were indifferent. They treated her with a cool formality, as if she were a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Meals were quiet affairs, filled with conversation about business or farming, but never about feelings or the things that mattered. Eleanor learned early on that she had to fend for herself. She washed the dishes, swept the floors, and did whatever was asked of her. But she never felt truly seen or appreciated. As she grew older, her sense of worth seemed to shrink. She felt as though she were just taking up space, existing without any real purpose. When Eleanor reached her early 20s, she began to realize the grim truth. She was no longer a child, and her chances for a future were slipping away. In her small town, women were expected to marry young, start families, and take on the roles of wives and mothers. But Eleanor had never had a suitor. Her relatives rarely talked to her about marriage, and the few men she came across seemed to pass her by, more interested in the women with livelier personalities, women who fit the mold of what society expected. Eleanor had no education, no social skills to make her stand out. She didn't know how to play the piano like some girls, or how to entertain guests with a clever story or song. She had grown up in an environment that didn't encourage such things. All she knew was hard work and quiet endurance. One evening, while flipping through a local newspaper, her eyes caught something that made her heart skip a beat. Seeking a kind-hearted woman to help run a ranch, must be willing to marry. The ad was placed by a man named Isaac Carson, a rancher in Wyoming. It wasn't a proposal, but the thought of marrying a stranger in exchange for the chance at a different life filled her with a mixture of hope and fear. Could this be her chance to escape the suffocating life she had known? Eleanor had heard of ranchers in Wyoming, of their vast lands and hard work. It was a world entirely different from the quiet, stagnant life she had in her relative's home. Still, the idea of traveling so far, to a place she knew nothing about, terrified her. But at the same time, it offered a flicker of hope. Could this be the way out she had longed for? She wasn't sure if she had the courage to say yes. But the alternative, the life she was currently living, was becoming unbearable. The next day, Eleanor's decision was made. She packed a small bag, unsure of what exactly to bring, but just enough to keep her going on the long journey ahead. She knew that this could be her only chance to find a life of her own. The thought of being chosen, even if just for a marriage of convenience, gave her a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in years. The journey to Wyoming was long and tiring. Eleanor traveled by train for days, her heart heavy with a mix of emotions. She felt excited, yes, but also deeply afraid. What if Isaac didn't like her? What if she was making a terrible mistake? She spent hours staring out the window, watching the changing landscape, but she couldn't shake the unease in her chest. She had never met Isaac Carson, and yet, she was about to place her entire future in his hands. When she arrived in Wyoming, the land seemed as vast and empty as the feeling inside her. The town was small, and the ranch was located far outside of it. Nestled among miles of untamed wilderness, the air was dry, and the sun seemed to beat down relentlessly. A far cry from the familiar, temperate weather she had known all her life. She had always been used to quiet, rural life. But this was different. It was wide open, raw, and untamed. When she finally arrived at the ranch, she felt her heart sink. The place was larger than she had expected, but it wasn't a picturesque, charming home like the ones in novels. Instead, it was a worn structure, built of wood and stone, with the faint smell of hay and livestock in the air. It was functional, not beautiful. The work around the ranch seemed to be never-ending. There were animals to care for, fields to tend to, and fences to mend. Isaac Carson was waiting for her, standing just outside the door of the house. He was a tall man, but not imposing. His face was weathered from years of working under the harsh sun. His hair a bit unruly. His clothes simple but practical. He didn't smile when he saw her, but he did give a nod. He looked her over, his gaze steady but not unkind. "You're Eleanor, then?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Yes," she replied, suddenly feeling small under his gaze. She had imagined this moment many times during the journey, but now that it was happening, she couldn't find the right words to say. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to allow her to enter. Eleanor walked into the house, feeling awkward, unsure of where to sit or how to act. She had no idea what to expect from Isaac Carson. He didn't seem excited to meet her, but there was no hostility in his eyes either. He simply seemed indifferent. The evening passed slowly. Isaac showed her around the ranch, explaining the various tasks she would need to help with, such as feeding the animals, milking the cows, and helping with the general upkeep of the land. His words were direct and to the point, lacking the warmth Eleanor had hoped for. She began to wonder if he had any interest in her at all, beyond the practical need for a woman to help run his ranch. After dinner, which was plain and simple, Isaac bid her good night with another brief nod. Eleanor retired to the small room that had been prepared for her. As she lay down on the uncomfortable bed, her mind raced. Had she made a mistake? Was this the life she had dreamed of, or was she simply another servant in a man's world? The silence of the ranch felt heavy, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was unwanted, that she had been lured here under false pretenses. She had come in search of love, but all she felt now was isolation. The days that followed Eleanor's arrival at Isaac's ranch were long, filled with hard work and quiet moments. The sense of loneliness she had carried with her from her old life seemed to follow her here, growing heavier with each passing day. At first, the tasks on the ranch were overwhelming. She had no experience with the animals or the land. The cows, the chickens, and the horses all seemed like strange creatures to her, and she was unsure how to handle them. Isaac, however, was patient, showing her the ropes without ever offering any words of encouragement or praise. Each day, she woke before the sun rose, just as Isaac did, and spent the morning feeding the animals and cleaning the barn. She was always tired, but there was little time to rest. Isaac would occasionally show her how to fix fences or mend tools, but his instructions were always brief, given in his quiet, straightforward manner. She could sense that he wasn't used to speaking much, but that only made her feel more isolated. There were no conversations in the evenings, no shared moments of warmth or laughter. It felt as though he had simply brought her here to do the work, not because he wanted her as a partner, but because he needed a helping hand. Eleanor tried to push away the growing sense of discomfort she felt, but it lingered. She was always aware of how little Isaac seemed to notice her. He never asked about her past or made any attempts to learn who she really was. It was as if she were just another part of the landscape, a worker on his ranch, no different from the animals or the land he tended. This lack of connection hurt more than she expected, especially since she had come here with the hope that perhaps, over time, they might grow to understand each other, even if only a little. One afternoon, after a long day of fixing fences, Eleanor found herself sitting on a low wooden fence post, feeling the weight of exhaustion in her shoulders. She glanced up at Isaac, who was working nearby, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to think about how different her life might have been if she hadn't come to the ranch. Back home, though it was lonely, she at least understood what to expect from her life. There, she was familiar with the routine, even if it was dull and unfulfilling. But here, in this new world, nothing felt familiar. Nothing felt safe. The wind blew gently through the fields, and Eleanor sighed, wiping the sweat from her brow. Her mind wandered back to the last time she had felt like someone cared about her. It was a long time ago, before her parents' deaths, when she was just a little girl. Her mother had always made her feel special, loved, But after she was gone, that feeling had disappeared, and Eleanor had learned to live without it. Now, here, with Isaac, she was starting to wonder if love was something that just didn't exist for her. As if sensing her thoughts, Isaac suddenly spoke, breaking the silence. "Do you need help with that?" he asked, his voice low but not unkind. Eleanor glanced up at him, surprised that he had even noticed her. He was still working, but his tone was different, less distant, more focused on her. She shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. What was the point? She had been here for weeks now, and nothing had changed. Isaac paused for a moment, then continued his work. But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her wonder. That night, after the chores were done and dinner was eaten in silence, Eleanor went to her small room, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her. She had tried so hard to keep her thoughts to herself, to focus only on the work, but the emptiness she felt inside was harder to ignore each day. She wanted to believe that Isaac was a man who simply wasn't good at expressing himself, that he was shy or reserved, but deep down, she feared that perhaps he just didn't care at all. The next morning, as she was washing the dishes, Isaac came into the kitchen, his face looking more serious than usual. He didn't say anything at first, but his presence in the room seemed to hang there like an unspoken question. Eleanor hesitated before finally speaking. "You don't have to worry about me," she said, her voice soft, almost fragile. "I'll manage. I'm used to being alone." Isaac looked at her, his gaze searching her face for a moment. He didn't answer right away, and Eleanor wondered if he even understood what she meant. After all, what could he possibly know about the loneliness she felt? "I'm not worried about you," he said finally, his voice steady. I want to make sure you're okay." Eleanor didn't know how to respond to that. His words were so simple, but they carried a weight that she hadn't expected. She wasn't sure if he was just saying it out of politeness, or if there was something more behind it. She had been living in a world of silence, of unspoken things. And now, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Isaac's words made her wonder if perhaps, just maybe, he cared more than she thought. The next few days brought a subtle change. Isaac's actions, while still quiet and reserved, seemed to carry more consideration. When he saw her struggling with a task, he would offer help, but it wasn't forced. He didn't hover or treat her like she couldn't manage. Instead, he gave her the space she needed to work, offering assistance when it was clear she was overwhelmed. Eleanor began to notice these small gestures. The way he made sure she had enough food on her plate, the way he fixed a fence post that had been leaning for days without mentioning it, and the way he always made sure she was comfortable at night, even if it was just by adjusting the fire in the stove. These were simple things, small acts of kindness, but to Eleanor, they felt like a lifeline. She had been so used to being ignored, to being unnoticed, that even the smallest gestures from Isaac made her heart flutter with hope. Was it possible that he cared about her? One evening, as they worked together in the barn, Isaac spoke again, though his words were unexpected. "You're doing well," he said quietly, wiping his brow with the sleeve of his shirt. "Better than I thought you would." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. His words were nothing special, just a simple compliment. But coming from him, they felt like more than that. She looked up at him, her eyes searching for something in his face that might tell her what he really thought. Isaac didn't seem to notice the way her gaze lingered on him. He just kept working, his focus on the task at hand. But to Eleanor, his words were like a key, unlocking a door in her heart. She had come to the ranch, believing she was unwanted, that she was just another worker to Isaac. But now, in the quiet of the barn, she realized that maybe, just maybe, he saw her as something more. The days passed, and the ranch began to feel less like a place she had been sent to, and more like a home. It wasn't perfect, and Isaac was still a man of few words. But there was something between them now. A quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. The work was still hard, and the loneliness still lingered at times, but for the first time, Eleanor felt a spark of hope. Maybe things were changing. Slowly but surely, and perhaps, just perhaps, Isaac Carson was beginning to see her not as just a helper, but as someone who belonged beside him. The days on the ranch continued to stretch out before Eleanor, each one blending into the next. Though the work was hard, she had grown accustomed to the routines. The mornings were always the same, the sun rising over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, followed by the quiet hum of life on the ranch. The animals needed to be fed, the barn needed to be cleaned, and the fields needed tending. Every day, Eleanor found herself busy with tasks. But there was a sense of purpose to it now that hadn't been there before. Isaac's presence, too, seemed to be a steady part of her days. He was still a man of few words, but Eleanor had started to understand his way of showing care. The things he did for her were small, checking to make sure she had enough firewood for the stove, ensuring that the well was in good working order, offering a quick word of encouragement when she struggled with a task, but they were enough. His actions spoke louder than any words could. He didn't demand much of her, except for hard work, but that was something she was used to. And slowly, very slowly, she started to feel like she mattered. One afternoon, as Eleanor worked in the garden, planting vegetables for the coming season, she heard Isaac's footsteps behind her. He didn't say anything at first, but she could feel his presence like a shadow falling over her. She paused in her work, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, and turned to face him. "You're doing a good job out here," Isaac said, his voice quiet but steady. "The crops will grow well with the way you've been taking care of things." "Oprah." Eleanor blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected a compliment. Isaac rarely spoke to her directly like this, and his words seemed more significant than she had thought possible. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, though she wasn't sure how to respond. The words, "thank you," didn't seem to do justice to the feeling inside her, so she simply nodded, offering him a small smile. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to look at Isaac in a different light. He wasn't just a man she worked for. He was a man who had noticed her efforts. He was beginning to see her, to recognize her as more than just a helper around the house. And though he didn't say it outright, Eleanor could sense that something had changed between them. That evening, after they had finished their chores, Eleanor found herself lingering by the kitchen, organizing the plates for dinner. Isaac had gone to the barn to tend to the horses, but she could hear the sounds of the evening wind outside, carrying with it the scent of fresh hay and earth. It was a peaceful sound, and for the first time since she had arrived, Eleanor felt a sense of calm in the quiet. She wasn't just waiting for the days to pass. She was beginning to enjoy the rhythm of life on the ranch. Later that night, as they sat at the table for dinner, there was an unusual stillness between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was different from the usual silence. Eleanor noticed that Isaac wasn't eating as quickly as usual, and for once, his gaze seemed to linger on her, as though he were trying to figure out what to say. "You've been here a while now," he said eventually, his voice softer than usual. "How are you holding up?" Eleanor was caught off guard by the question. She had never really been asked how she was doing before, and the sincerity in his tone made her heart flutter. She looked down at her plate, unsure of how to answer. "I'm doing all right," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard work, but I'm getting used to it. And I'm grateful for it." Isaac nodded, though he didn't say anything else. The conversation didn't go any deeper, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he wanted to say. Maybe it was the way his eyes seemed to soften when he looked at her, or the way his fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of his mug. For the first time, Eleanor thought that Isaac might be holding something back. He was a man who rarely shared his thoughts, and it seemed like he had something on his mind, something that he wasn't ready to say. The days continued, and Eleanor worked alongside Isaac in relative silence. But the quietness between them had changed. It wasn't the same as it had been when she first arrived, when she had felt like an outsider. Now, there was a sense of companionship in their silence. They worked together, side by side, without needing to fill the air with conversation. There was a comfort in it, a subtle understanding that neither of them needed to speak to be connected. One day, as Eleanor was walking back from the garden, she found Isaac by the fence, leaning against it and watching the horizon. She had grown used to the sight of him. But today, there was something different about the way he stood, something pensive in the way his shoulders were slumped. "Isaac?" she called, her voice tentative. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind blew gently through the grass, and the distant sound of a cow lowing in the field seemed to fill the silence. "I've been thinking," Isaac said slowly, his voice quieter than usual. "About you. About this whole situation." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but something in his tone made her feel uneasy. She took a step closer to him, her hands brushing against the fabric of her apron. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Isaac shifted slightly, as if weighing his words. "I know I haven't been the easiest person to get along with. I know I don't talk much, and I'm not the best at showing my feelings. But I appreciate everything you've done here. You've worked hard, and I can see that." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't know how to respond to his words, unsure whether they were meant to comfort her or to make her feel more uncertain. Isaac wasn't the kind of man to give compliments easily, and hearing him speak so openly was both surprising and humbling. "I've come to realize," Isaac continued, his voice steady but hesitant, "that this ranch, this life, it's not just about work. It's about something more than that. And I'm starting to think that maybe I've been wrong about a lot of things." Eleanor's breath caught in her chest. She wasn't sure what he meant, but the way he was speaking made her heart race. "You're not wrong," she said quietly, looking up at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "I'm not just here to work. I'm here because I want to be a part of this. A part of you." Isaac was silent for a moment, and Eleanor couldn't read the look on his face. He was staring at her, but his expression was hard to decipher. Then, slowly, he took a deep breath and stepped closer to her, his eyes softening. "I know," he said softly. "I'm starting to see that too." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt like they truly understood each other. The unspoken bond that had been growing between them, hidden beneath the surface of their everyday lives, was finally beginning to surface. Isaac didn't say much more after that, but the change was undeniable. It wasn't in the things he said, but in the way he acted. The small gestures of kindness that he had shown her before now seemed to carry more weight. They weren't just acts of courtesy, they were expressions of something deeper, something neither of them had been able to put into words. As the days passed, Eleanor found herself beginning to trust him more. She still didn't fully understand him, but she could feel the connection between them strengthening, even without words. They were both learning, slowly, how to be a part of each other's lives, in a way that was more than just about survival. About getting through the days. They were beginning to see each other not as strangers, not as workers on a ranch, but as two people who had found something worth holding on to. The days on the ranch continued to pass quietly, and with each passing one, Eleanor felt the weight of change settling gently around her. The once distant ranch that had seemed so cold and unfamiliar now felt a bit more like home. She had come to understand Isaac better, not just through his words, but through the small, everyday actions he took. He wasn't a man who expressed much verbally, but in his simple gestures, how he made sure the fire was always stoked in the morning, or how he'd give her a slight nod of approval after she completed a task, Eleanor felt a deeper connection growing between them. It was a quiet connection, but one that seemed to speak volumes. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, Isaac and Eleanor found themselves sitting on the porch of the small house. The day had been long, and they were both exhausted from the work. Yet, there was a calm between them now that hadn't been there when Eleanor first arrived. Isaac had been quieter than usual that evening, and Eleanor couldn't help but notice the thoughtful expression on his face as he gazed out at the landscape. "I never thought I'd get used to it out here," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but it felt like the right time to speak. Isaac turned his head slightly, glancing at her. There was a small flicker of surprise in his eyes, as if he hadn't expected her to speak. For a moment, he said nothing, but then, slowly, he nodded. "It's different than what you're used to, isn't it?" he replied. His voice had a calm, steady quality to it that made her feel as though he truly understood. Eleanor nodded in agreement, feeling the weight of his words. She had grown accustomed to the land, the weather, and the way of life here. But there was a deep, sometimes unsettling quietness about the place that had taken time to adjust to. In the beginning, she had often wondered if she had made a mistake coming here. But now, as she sat beside Isaac, she felt that she had found a place where, perhaps, she truly belonged. "I wasn't sure I'd make it," Eleanor continued, her voice quieter this time, as if the admission was one she hadn't intended to say out loud. "I thought I'd end up just a stranger in your world, just another person here to do the work." Isaac didn't answer immediately, but she could see the way his jaw tightened slightly. He turned his full attention to her, his eyes softer now, as though he were really seeing her for the first time. "You're not just someone here to do the work, Eleanor," Isaac said, his voice low but steady. "I've never seen you as just that." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had never expected Isaac to speak to her this way. He had always been a man of few words, and his emotions had seemed hidden beneath layers of silence. But now, there was something different about the way he spoke, something honest and vulnerable, and it made her feel both nervous and comforted at the same time. Before Eleanor could respond, Isaac shifted in his chair, his gaze turning back to the setting sun. He took a deep breath, his fingers brushing the edge of his hat as he did. Eleanor waited, unsure of what to expect next. "I've never been good at showing how I feel," Isaac said slowly, almost as though the words were difficult for him to say. "I've spent so much of my life working that I forgot what it was like to truly connect with someone." Eleanor listened intently, her heart beginning to race. Isaac, the man who had barely spoken to her for weeks, was opening up in a way that took her completely by surprise. She realized then how much she had longed to hear him speak like this, to hear him share his thoughts, even if it was only in small pieces. He turned toward her again, his eyes now meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "I don't want you to think that I brought you here for anything other than wanting you here," Isaac continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "You've worked hard, and I've seen it. But it's more than that. You've become part of this place, part of my life." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening as she processed what he was saying. For so long, she had felt like she was merely filling a role on the ranch, nothing more than a helper, someone who did what was asked of her. But now, with Isaac's words, she felt something stir inside her. She wasn't just here because she had no other choice. She was here because Isaac had come to care for her. And, just maybe, she had begun to care for him, too. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't planned on saying it, but the words came out before she could stop them. Isaac didn't respond right away. And for a moment, there was nothing but the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. The silence stretched between them. But this time, it didn't feel heavy or uncomfortable. It was as if they were both sitting with the truth of what had been said. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible smile, Isaac looked at her and said, "I never thought I'd find someone who could make this place feel like home." Eleanor's heart fluttered, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words to respond. She simply looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt, any hint that he might be unsure of what he had said. But there was none. Isaac was speaking with the same quiet sincerity he always had, but now there was something more in his eyes, a vulnerability that made her heart ache with tenderness. As the night deepened and the stars began to emerge in the sky above, the two of them sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts, yet closer than ever before. The bond between them had shifted, no longer just one of convenience, but one that had begun to grow into something more meaningful. The next morning, as they began their usual chores, Eleanor found herself stealing glances at Isaac. His movements were the same, steady and sure, but now, when their eyes met, there was a new understanding between them. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It wasn't just about the land or the animals. It was about the two of them, learning to trust one another, learning to care for one another in ways they hadn't anticipated. Later that afternoon, as they took a break by the well, Isaac spoke again, his tone quieter than usual. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said last night, about how you never thought you'd find someone like me." Eleanor raised her eyebrows, wondering where this conversation was headed. Isaac seemed to be searching for the right words, his brow furrowed as he looked at the ground. "I've never been good at asking for things," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I've learned something over these last few months, and I don't want to waste any more time pretending I don't feel the way I do." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching as she realized what he was saying. Isaac, the quiet rancher who had never shown his emotions, was opening his heart to her in a way she hadn't expected. The realization made her feel lightheaded, as though the earth beneath her had shifted, and she was standing on solid ground for the first time in her life. Without thinking, Eleanor stepped closer to him, her hands trembling slightly. Isaac raised his eyes to meet hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. They both knew what was in their hearts, and they didn't need words to express it. Finally, Isaac broke the silence with a simple, heartfelt question. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and sincere, "will you be my wife?" Eleanor's breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't respond. But then, as the weight of his words sank in, she felt a rush of emotions she couldn't contain. She had come to this ranch feeling like a stranger, unsure of what her future held. But now, in this quiet, vulnerable moment, she knew the answer. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, her heart full. In that moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. All that mattered was the two of them, two people who had found each other. Despite the silence, despite the loneliness, and despite the uncertainty, together, they had built something more than just a life on a ranch. They had built a future,